Okay, well, while we're letting the last few people in, I would like to just thank everybody for the time to attend this webinar. It is a joint webinar, as we've said, with our IT colleagues, ASM, and it is to give an overview of the changes for CDS relative to exports. Now, we are all aware that CDS imports is pretty much in and up and running. It's still got a few gremlins, but it is working. And in particular, I would like to thank Simon Adams of ASM for his time and effort in preparing this presentation. It's quite technical, but it will give you a good overview of the changes. I think the first thing I'd like to say is, of course, the vast majority of BIFA members do both import and export work. And so many of the lessons which have been learnt from CDS imports are equally applicable to the export mode. And I think that's important to bear in mind. However, there are some, not many, who actually have not actually use the CDS imports, and it's important that you think about the basics, the government gateway credentials, how to use the CDS dashboard, how to add staff as users, etc. For those already using imports, it is an extension of what you're already doing, and in many ways the transition to exports will be easier than for imports, if only because there are no financials involved. You don't have to worry about deferments and guarantees and all of that sort of stuff. And that's quite a big plus. Without preempting Simon's comments, we have actually had a long discussion, Simon and me and my colleagues Igor and Pavel, on this subject, and we would highlight three key points. The first is the issues surrounding muckers. Whilst there is a dual running period for Chief and CDS, this is going to be a problem. Our understanding is that this will diminish once that Chief is completely shut down and CDS is only operational. You have to remember, when you're dealing with this, you may be dealing with entities who are on Chief while you might be on CDS, so there's conversion of messaging, and that's where part of the problems are. I think also the other thing is Simon gives some interesting tips about methods to avoid the issue. They may be controversial, but I can understand exactly where he's coming from. And we do go back to this point. Members have to understand the importance of closing the muckers. So much of what we do is automated, so you don't actually even think about it. But in a way, we're back to old-fashioned forwarding of things being semi-automated. So you have to actually think in your own mind, have I shut that mucker? And if you take nothing away from this thing today, please focus on the mucker. Right. There are an awful lot of you. Last count, it was certainly over 770 my count is showing. So obviously we can't have live questions, but what I would ask you to do is please put a question in the chat. My colleague Igor is monitoring them. At the end of the meeting, Simon will pass back briefly to myself for me to make a few closing comments, and then Igor will look at the chat and try and pull some things together. The presentation will be shared via the BIFA website. So within the CDS section of BIFA website, you will have to go and find it, I'm afraid. That is a member-only section, so you will need your logon credentials. And if I may remember correctly, they can be found at bifa.coms@bifa.org. And if you email that for your logon credentials, I'm sure somebody will be able to help you. Simon and I actually said, what's the main message of this? Well, obviously the muckers is part of it, but the key message is practice, 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 because everything we learn on CDS imports makes that so essential. The more you prepare, the more you practice, the more you try using the trade address rehearsal for your declarations, it will help you. We've already seen CDS exports working in a non-inventory linked environment, so that's RoRo via the short straits, Dover, Folkestone, places like that, and it is working. The big difference between the change between import and export is imports we were able to negotiate and bargain with HMRC to get some extensions to the implementation process. We do not believe at this moment in time that there will be such a generous implementation period if something goes wrong. So we have to urge people to take this very, very seriously. Once again, many thanks to you all for attending. And I'm going to pass to my opposite number, Simon, in ASM, and ask him to provide his excellent presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Robert. As Robert said, I'm Simon Adams. I'm Program Manager for ASM. We provide the Sequoia software that some of you may use. My presentation is not about our software. I do mention it once or twice, but it's not focusing on ASM software. It's focusing on the generalities of CDS and CDS exports. But what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about this morning is various things. We're actually going to start with CDS imports, strangely. Just a review of how CDS imports has gone and lessons we've hopefully learned from CDS imports. Then we'll move on to exports. We'll cover GVMS and RoRo, non-inventory linked exports, and how they are going. They are live now, have been for a while. We'll then cover briefly what are inventory linked exports. It's not necessarily that obvious what's an inventory linked export. It's not as clear as it is on the import side. So we'll just cover what we actually mean by inventory linked exports. We'll then go on and just go through why is it actually so difficult to do inventory linked exports during the migration from Chief to CDS. It's a lot more difficult than inventory linked imports was for various reasons, which hopefully will become clear. Then we'll go on to what you can actually do now to ensure migration is smooth. There are things before you actually start to migrate that can really help you in the journey. And then finally, we'll just go briefly through the timeline for migration of the inventory linked export migration. It is coming very quickly. But we'll leave that joyous bit till last. So CDS imports, where are we? What have we learned? Well, they're live in GB. They went live in GB in October 2022, even earlier for Northern Ireland traffic. But they've been live for over a year. All import declarations are now on CDS. There are now no longer any import declarations on Chief. It was quite a long process of getting that across the line. There's been technical issues with people with EORI numbers and groups and VAT groups and that sort of stuff, as well as some challenges of getting the system up and running. But all imports are now on CDS as of about a month ago. It's working well. Some might dispute that, but generally it's working well. There are still some workarounds in place as they find solutions to putting in new business rules and making sure various regimes and procedures are all working properly. But generally it's working well. There are still some improvements that can be made, but that's a forward process. But generally the system is working well for the declaration side. A brief, as Robert mentioned it in his introduction, of testing. On the CDS import side, there was access to TDR, which is the trade address rehearsal environment. It's basically sorry, wrong bullet point. You should contact your service provider. If you're not using ASM Sequoia, you contact your software provider if you don't already have access to TDR. I'm not sure what other software providers do as far as access. If you've got ASM Sequoia, you've got access to it in the live application. But it's as I say, it's a live-like environment. It's real data. It's pretty much exactly the same as the live environment. The tariffs there, all the ORI numbers and authorizations and all that sort of stuff is set up. It's available 24 hours a day. And the main lesson to be learned from imports was those who tested in TDR before they migrated were much more likely to succeed. We saw that time and time again from our service desk at ASM. Those who practiced, it was much more smooth transition when they actually went live. So onto exports. We'll come back to testing and practicing near the end, but for now, so on exports, the current position on exports with GVMS exports and RoRo, so non-inventory linked exports, they are live now. Migration initially was due to be completed by the November just gone. 25% of all export declarations are now on CDS. So these are all non-inventory linked ones, all that go through GVMS controlled locations. So 25% of all export declarations are now on CDS. And they're the ones that are typically declared as arrived, EXA in box 1 or data element 1 and 1.2, depending on how you look at things. Again, generally working well. The declaration side of CDS is pretty much working well. There are still slight holes in it, slight things that need changing, amending, improving, but generally the declaration side of CDS imports and exports is working pretty well. So the only thing that's really left to migrate are inventory linked exports. They are there's no inventory systems based on the various CSPs, CCS UK, CNS, MCP, like there is on imports. So you can't go in and claim an inventory consignment and then use the UCN for exports, or get notified from CCS UK of this airway bill inventory record. That doesn't exist on the export side. So generally, inventory linked exports are declared as pre-lodged, so EXD in box 1. They are then delivered to the frontier and arrived at the frontier. So the port or the shed or the wharf or whatever arrives the goods once they get to the frontier, and they get controlled from there on in. So 70% of all exports move through inventory linked ports and airports. So that is the bulk of exports, and that's the bulk of the migration we're now looking at in the next few months. They possibly have duckers associated to a mucker. That isn't the only way to tell if an export is inventory linked. Some inventory linked exports haven't got a mucker, so they're just working at ducker level. So if it's an air export through CCS UK, then there's always a mucker. Even if there's just a shipment, a direct shipment, one declaration, it's always associated to a mucker. Ocean and road, not quite the same. Sometimes they use a mucker, but not always. Typically on the ocean side, if you're, I'll come on to it in a minute, but if you've got a shipment on ocean or road with more than one declaration involved in it, then it's usual to associate those declarations, those duckers, to a mucker, because it's then easier to report just the mucker rather than a handful of duckers at the frontier. So inventory linking, as I say, there are no inventories supported by CSPs, CCS UK, CNS, MCP, Penton. That doesn't exist so much on the export side. So that actually makes inventory linking a lot more difficult for exports than it is for imports. There are various phases to the export migration for that very reason. From phase 2, which is really what we're talking about, and more on that in a moment. From phase 2, export declarations can be on CDS or Chief. The loaders who are arriving and departing these things at the frontier can be on CDS or Chief. And declarations on both systems can be linked to the same mucker. So you can have a mucker with a couple of declarations on Chief and a couple of declarations on CDS, and those two systems are different systems. They don't naturally talk to each other. But what is really necessary once the goods arrive at the frontier is that the loader, the shed or the port, needs to know the overall status of all of these goods, wherever they are, wherever they're declared, and however they're linked together. So the middleware that actually does all the choreography and controls all this stuff is called CDA. CDA stands for Chief DMS Aggregator for whatever reason, but CDA for short. It's a complex beast. It's a bit of middleware that customs have developed to try and tie all this stuff together. And because it's so complex and because there's different bits happening all at once, the migration is taking place in various phases, which I'll just go through very briefly now. I don't want to get too complex, but it will show you why it's, hopefully show you why it's quite a difficult thing to get the whole thing working. So ILE phase 0, ILE is inventory linked exports, by the way. ILE phase 0 is where we are now, or where we started from before CDS was even conceived, where declarations, consolidation messages, that's associations, disassociations, closing muckers, they're called consolidation messages, and movement messages, arrivals, departures, and all that stuff. All those by all the parties involved in exports was sent directly to Chief. So quite reasonably simple to control. Chief is where all the information was stored, everything happened, and all the control took place. A reasonably easy model to work with. Then CDS was conceived and CDS started to get developed, and it was fairly quickly realized that these two systems, CDS and Chief, during any migration and any dual running of systems until Chief was decommissioned, there would need to be some choreography in the middle where something sorted out what Chief knows, what CDS knows about various duckers and muckers, and can tell somebody who's arrived the goods or needs to depart the goods what's going on and whether export is allowed or not allowed, or the current state of any shipments, export shipments. So CDA was invented as a bit of middleware where during phase 1, all the CSPs involved in exports could start sending all the consolidation messages they received from forwarders and any movement messages they received from sheds and ports and airports. They could start sending those messages to CDA, which would then just pass them on to Chief and then pass the responses back. We're still, at this point, Chief is still the controller, if you like, of the export movement, but CDA is being used as a way of passing the consolidation and movement messages backwards and forwards. So there's still no inventory linked export declarations on CDS. All the CSPs have to be in a position where they can talk to this CDA component before inventory linked exports can be declared to CDS. So that's what's happening at the moment. All of the CSPs involved in the process, CNS, MCP, CCS UK, Penton, DHL, are in various stages of migrating to point consolidation and movement messages to this CDA component. They all have to be ready before you can start, as a forwarder, you can start declaring exports to CDS. So that is almost there. They're not all the CSPs aren't connected all the time to CDA at the moment, but that's happening very, very soon. The next stage is the one we're really talking about, is where you can start migrating your export declarations to CDS away from Chief. And as you can see by all those various arrows, that does make choreographing all the information you need through CDA a reasonably complex beast. That's why it's taken so long to be developed, tested, fixed, bug fixed, and stabilized. So that's the position we're looking at, the migration and starting the migration. We'll come onto the timelines at the end, but that is pretty much where we're getting to now. So, So phase 3, which will happen once all the declarations are going to CDS, is not far away. It's the end state of where systems are getting to, where customs obviously want to get to. It's where all export declarations are on CDS. All associations, closed muckers, dep arrivals, that sort of stuff, consolidation messages, movement messages, all those are going through CDA, but just talking to CDS. Chief is then decommissioned, and we all live happily ever after. That's the great plan. As I say, that is not far away. So what we're going to talk about next becomes very much in focus and very important to consider. So what can you do now to ensure your migration is smooth? Migration hasn't started yet. As we say, we'll come onto the timelines at the end, but there are things you can do now, even though you haven't started migrating, to make sure that your journey is smoother and it all works properly when you do migrate. The first thing, oddly, is something that should have been happening all the time. Making sure that if you do use a mucker on an export shipment, that you close that mucker before you deliver to the frontier. Very important. It applies for chief declarations now, not just once you start migrating. For every export shipment where you use a mucker, you should be closing that mucker before you deliver the goods to the frontier. It's been best practice for years. For anybody who can remember the airline delivery schedule that was introduced way back in the day, that was a way of software producing an airline delivery schedule report to say that all the associations from duckers to muckers had been done and the mucker had been closed and everything was fine by the time it got to the border. So that has been best practice for years. There are still significant numbers currently of muckers that aren't closed before the goods arrive at the frontier. It's in the thousands per year, although that number has reduced reasonably significantly. There's been comms went out from customs. I did a webinar to ASM Sequoia users before Christmas, emphasising this very point. And there's been work from the CCS UK user group contacting some of the worst culprits, informing them of the best practice and what they need to be doing. But there are still significant numbers currently that aren't closed before arrival. Happens all the time now, and generally you deliver the goods to a shed. The shed would then arrive the goods into Chief. Chief would come back and say mucker open. So the shed would have to contact you as a forwarder and say you need to close the mucker. You'd close the mucker in your system, and then the shed would update and the goods would be exported and would be absolutely fine. Once migration starts and there is dual running, declarations could be on Chief, could be on CDS during that dual running period, that will not necessarily work as smoothly as it does now. If you haven't closed the mucker when you deliver the goods to the frontier, again, the shed will get mucker open or no declaration or whatever they get back, saying something's not right. They will contact you and say you need to close the mucker. If you then go into your system and close the mucker, that will not necessarily update the shed and give the goods permission to progress. There are problems with, there's a high likelihood that that will not work. And until it works, until the situation's regularized, your goods aren't going anywhere. So you could get delayed goods not being exported. So there are workarounds, but they are manual workarounds, and they might involve the shed or you or both talking to NCH to get manual permission to export. So it's very, very important that you close the mucker and start making sure you do it now before you even start migrating, to make sure that when you do, you don't get these sort of problems. So in summary, again, for air, any air shipment through CCS UK airports, there's always a mucker. Even if there's just one declaration on the goods being shipped, that declaration is always linked to a mucker, so that mucker always needs closing. For ocean or road, don't use a mucker if you don't need to. If you've got an ocean export container full of goods, but it's all covered by one declaration, you don't need to associate that to a mucker and give the mucker to the CSP. You can give them the ducker and their systems work quite happily without a mucker. Same with road. If you don't need to use a mucker, don't. If they're just individual declarations, for GVMS, you don't need muckers. For inventory linked road exports, if it's only one declaration for those goods, just use the ducker. You don't need to associate it to a mucker. That will reduce the chance of these problems happening. So how you actually close a mucker differs depending on your software. I brought this up when I did the webinar before Christmas to ASM Sequoia users, because users aren't normally aware using our software that they are actually closing a mucker, and it's probably the same for whatever software you happen to be using. So in Sequoia, to close a mucker, once you've done everything you need to do on a shipment, the declarations are done, the new paperwork's done, you just open the shipment editor and finalize the shipment. So there's a finalize button I've highlighted at the top there. You click that, brings up a dialog. You stick in the date, you click on finalize, and as far as you're concerned, that's all you need to do. In the background, our software is looking at all the declarations in that shipment, seeing if a mucker is required, sending the messages to associate the duckers all to the mucker. Once it's done that, it would then send the message to close the mucker. And after sometimes a little delay to make sure all the messages come back, it updates to say the shipment's finalized and gives you a date and time to show you what date and time the mucker was actually closed, and make sure you've done it. It will then, on an air shipment, it will produce an airline delivery schedule as well. Whether you actually print that off or not, you don't really need to, as long as one's generated, that generally tells you that everything's fine. So that's from our software point of view. If you're not using ASM Sequoia, why not? No, sorry. You should contact your supplier to check how to close muckers, to see that it is being done in the background, because otherwise you could definitely get problems when you start migrating. What else can you do to ensure migration is smooth? As Robert said at the beginning, and it's a bit of a catchphrase, practice, practice, practice. As we said at the start, everybody should have access to the trade address rehearsal environment, TDR. In Sequoia, you've got that ability in your live declaration software. I don't know if the same is true for other declaration software. You should definitely contact your software supplier to make sure you have access to TDR. As we said earlier in the presentation, it's a live-like environment. It's got real data. It's got your EORI numbers, your customers' EORI numbers, authorizations are all set up, the tariff is there. It's just like the live environment without the compliance issues. And following the lessons from imports, those who test in TDR are much more likely to migrate successfully. If you take some time to look at your shipments that you export all the time, try to declare those to CDS. It's different from Chief, so there will be differences, but sort out all the issues you might have and the lessons you need to learn in the TDR environment before you migrate, because you can practice. Once you've got them right and you start migrating, you know that you're not going to get any delays because you can't put your declarations through. Contact your software provider. If you're not using ASM Square, contact your software provider if you don't already have access to TDR, because it's a very important thing and it will make your chances of success much higher. Finally, what else you can do to ensure migration is smooth? You can consider sending your live export declarations directly to CDS. The position currently is, depending on what badges you've got with whatever CSPs, CNS, MCP, CCS UK, Penton, they are in different stages of letting you do export declarations. Some you can do export declarations now, not inventory linked ones yet, but you can do non-inventory linked ones so far. Others, badges by badge need to be enabled to allow you to do export declarations. So even if you wanted to start, not all CSPs are necessarily ready, but for exports, you do not have to send export declarations, even inventory linked ones, through a CSP. All export declarations, even the inventory linked ones, when they become available, and the timelines we'll come on to in a second, can be sent direct to CDS, even if they're inventory linked, because the inventory doesn't live on the CSP systems for exports. It lives in the custom software. That is true now with Chief. You could send all your export declarations now through Chief directly to Chief, or not directly through that a service called EDCS, which is essentially directly through to Chief. That service, not particularly robust. It relied on public email. It was a bit clunky, not necessarily very reliable, certainly at the end of the month when subdecks were being sent through it in volume. The direct link to CDS is robust, is reliable. It's a web service interface, just like the web service interfaces to the CSPs. It's actually more direct than going via a CSP because there's one less link in the chain, to be honest. But it is as quick as going through a CSP. It is as robust, and it is as reliable. And it's free. This is probably what Robert was saying is a bit of a controversial thing, but there are no charges per declaration or per transmission for sending export declarations to CDS directly rather than through a CSP. CSPs charge you if you send export declarations. Some charge you every time you hit the send button, not just once per declaration. But if you send it and get it wrong, have to amend it and send it again, they charge you twice. If you have to send it again, they charge you again. So there are various advantages to sending all your export declarations direct to CDS rather than through a CSP. But that's a commercial decision. It's just we're really duty bound to point that out. We don't have any allegiance to any particular CSP. You may do, but it's a decision you can make. Again, contact your software provider to set this up for you if that's the way you want to go. For Sequoia users, we've already told everybody how they can do that. They can always contact our service desk, but contact your software provider to set up sending exports direct to CDS rather than through a CSP. So the final part, and then you won't have to listen to me again. The timeline, we did this webinar before Christmas to ASM users ahead of customs publishing the timelines, but they have now since been published. CDS, there was a big release of CDS software version 4.3, which went live on the 10th of December, just before Christmas. That delivered upgrades and fixes to a lot of CDS and CDA issues. It's currently being tested by software developers, CSPs, to make sure it's stable. That testing is ongoing, but it does seem a lot better than before release 4.3 went on. So testing's not finished yet, so there's not a hugely clear picture, but it does look better, and it's certainly moving towards the migration. The timelines for migration, again, we have to say they're indicative timelines. They do depend on the testing that's going on at the moment, proving that everything is ready. But from customs published timelines at the moment, AIR should start in early February. That is really not long away. Followed in March, early March, by Ocean. The reason Ocean is going a bit later is because there are some issues that are being fixed around the performance of the system because of the way that the Ocean CSPs work. They generally, for a vessel, even though you're giving them goods at maybe ducker level, maybe mucker level, they're associating all those goods on one vessel to a sort of a super mucker, if you like, and then they arrive and depart that super mucker. That then has to arrive and depart thousands of declarations at the same time. So there were some performance issues discovered with that process, which are being addressed by customs, but they just needed a little more time to do that. So Ocean is probably not going to start, the migration of Ocean exports is not going to start until early March. But from the AIR point of view, that should start early February, which, as we say, is like 4 or 5 weeks away. So not long at all. So getting everything sorted now, set up, practice, getting everything ready would be a very, very good idea. HMRC have said they're committed to a 3-month migration window. So from early March, we are talking about, so March, April, May as the migration window. So for AIR, that would give you 4 months to migrate. For Ocean, it would give you 3 months to migrate. My very strong advice would be, don't wait till near the end. Practice now, start live as soon as possible, get everything sorted, make sure all your declarations work way ahead of the end of the migration window. Customs are committed to that. There will be an exceptions process like there was with imports, but it will be under very strict conditions. You won't just go onto a website, key your details in and say, can I have an exception? And customs will say, yes, of course. That will not happen with exports. You will have to apply specifically to customs. You will have to tell them why. You will have to give them good reason why you can't migrate or start to migrate to get any access to the exceptions process, and it will only be for a limited period of up to a month. There will not be this long tail of, well, pretty much a year on imports where you could just put it off, nobody really cared. Customs really do care this time, and they will be turning chief off. There are very good reasons, not just monetary. There are very good reasons for them turning chief off from a support point of view, various other reasons, but they are very serious about turning chief off. So the quicker you get on the bandwagon, the more practice you do now, the more you spend your time making sure you're all set up and ready to go, practicing, making sure you know what to do, the absolute better it is for you. I can't stress that enough. It's obviously your decision, but I would not personally like to be leaving it until near the end. That's all I have. I am going to now pass you back to Robert. I hope I've been clear what I've been saying. I hope I haven't waffled on too long, and I hope you're not too upset with my voice. But I will now shut up. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, Simon, thank you very much for that. You won't be shut up because you and I have known one another a long while, and you always make your views known. The other thing is, we have got some questions that will be been in the chat. Can I ask people to put their hands down? We did say at the start of the meeting, any questions would have to be via chat. Thank you. Okay, this move from chief to CDS is actually about process, and it's about process control. And we have emphasized time and time again, and there's 4 points I'd like to make. The first is practice, practice, practice. You know, do that. It's very, very important. As everything we've seen about CDS imports is the quicker you start, the more you try, the more you will be able to make sure that this process is as smooth as possible. It's not going to be perfect. These things never are. The next key lesson I think I took out of Simon's presentation is software. Talk to your software suppliers. There are some questions in the chat which we've seen which are software specific. We won't be able to answer those. The only people who can answer those are your software suppliers, so it's important that you liaise with them. Simon's made it very clear, and it's something we were always aware of, that the import process and export in terms of the structure and the inventory systems are very different. So I think you've got to think about your process and how you're going to do this. One of the things I've had has become very clear about is some members subcontract all their customs clearance out, but do their own exports, and they use something called NESWeb at the moment. And basically, you've got to think, you know, do I put my entries through a CSP, which is fine, or do I think of a direct interface with CDS? Now, there's one thing Simon didn't touch on, and I can understand why, but I better just point this out. At the moment, well, actually, in imports we saw for a long time, there were a series of easements which came about, and that allowed you to do things which, when CDS was fully up and running on imports, had to stop. There will be a transition period for some easements, and I think the big one to draw to everybody's attention is I don't know, what do we call it? LIC 99, the 999 election, the license waiver. Well, that disappeared for imports this January, and you'll be seeing next January that change. So when you are actually thinking about what you do, think, you know, what might be changing, and up to a point, CSPs, if you're using them, and or software people are the people to go. And I did take one point on board. You said something like decommission chief and live happily ever after. Well, this is probably the most significant domestic UK change for customs, but there will be others coming on, and you know, we will be looking at those on behalf of members and doing similar webinars. So Without much ado, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Igor, who has been gathering together, and perhaps we could have like four, depending on time, because I think we've only got a few minutes really. If you could run maybe 3 or 4 questions, Igor, for us.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
And this will be for Simon to address.
Yes, hopefully you found my replies helpful. I was trying to give you an answer as we went along to some of the basic questions. I think one of the most common one is the amending the entries. As you all aware, amending CDS entries is not, it doesn't work the same way as Chief. So you're not able to amend as soon as it's pre-lodged, or you submitted the entry and it's accepted by CDS by the system, you're not able to amend it. So you will have to submit a new one. Okay, for export, so some people ask the question if what's going to happen, they will hang around. No, that if they not arrived, let's say by GVMS, so they didn't leave the country, they're not departed, then after 150 days, those entries will be deleted. So they will, you will not have double entries linked to your CDS accounts. Okay, there's just quick clarification on that, because I see many people ask those questions. I've seen some questions, many questions they related to ASM, and I will pass those questions to Simon to answer, and I will collate we will collate a Q&A just to give you a better understanding on those subject matters. Many questions been asked about the markers, and users are not able to finalize it, or ASM system gives an error that the markers are not accepted by Sequoia. Now, Simon, if you can give a couple of comments about the markers processing at the moment by the system.
I'm not aware of any problems in Sequoia where that would be the case, but definitely if that is a problem, then those need to be raised with our service desk, so we can look at them. I'm not aware there's a fundamental problem with the software.
Okay. The other question which came up a couple of times is about arriving and departing export entries in Sequoia. Maybe Simon, you can give a couple of comments on that, how it will work.
You shouldn't need to do that, to be honest. Yeah. There is functionality coming on CDS to duplicate that arrival departure functionality for loaders, but generally if it's inventory linked, you should be doing pre-lodged. If it's GVMS, you should be doing arrived declarations. So you shouldn't need to do the arrival process or the departure process unless you're a loader.
Okay,
thank you. I'm not sure what
that's fine, Simon. I mean, just a quick picks actually from the list, but we'll get back to you with the list of questions, so maybe we can expand on those ones. So we will post the Q&A along with the slides, and probably the recording will be available on the BIFA website as well. So we will let you know, everyone, as soon as Q&A is available. I think the plan is for Sharon to send out an email and information to all of you who joined the call. If not, so you will be able to find it on BIFA website. Feel free to drop us an email and check if they are available. Okay. Thank you. And yep, I'll pass back to Robert.
Okay. I've seen a couple of questions. People seem to be particularly worried about the EXAs not being able to amend, and particularly impact on trade stats. Basically, trade stats are only comprise those entries which have departed. So therefore, if they're held in suspense, they won't figure in the trade stats. So that's at the moment all we can tell you on this subject. As I say, thank you very much for your attendance. It is actually probably the largest single meeting we've ever held. There were 783 people online at its maximum, and I can only just say thank you very much for your attendance and support. We will collate everything we can get together fairly soon. Just keep an eye on the CDS part of the website. We will probably post a news item where people can access it. So that will be up on the front page, but that'll be a day or so before we get it up. So thank you very much indeed, and we'll conclude the meeting. Thank you very much indeed.